At first, the case looked simple. Too simple. On a quiet weekday morning in a town where nothing ever seemed to happen on schedule, a single call came into the local police station. It was just after 8:20 a.m. A resident reported something off near the old railway access road. A car parked where it shouldn't be, doors unlocked, engine cold. By 9:05 a.m., officers were on scene. By 9:40 a.m., they believed they already understood what had happened. And by noon, the timeline had been written. According to the initial report, the victim had left home the previous evening at 7:30 p.m., was last seen at a nearby gas station at 7:52 p.m., and never made it to their destination. Surveillance footage supported the gas station stop. Phone records showed no activity after 8:01 p.m. It all appeared tragically consistent. On paper, it made sense. But timelines don't exist on paper. They exist in the real world, and the real world doesn't lie quietly for long. The town accepted the explanation quickly. They wanted closure. The local news ran with it. Police believe incident occurred late evening, one headline read. Another called it an unfortunate but straightforward case. Detectives, however, are trained to distrust the word straightforward. By the end of that first day, one investigator quietly circled a timestamp in red ink, 8:01 p.m. That was the last recorded phone activity, but something about it didn't sit right. The device didn't power down. There was no signal loss, no battery drain recorded. It simply stopped. Phones don't behave that way unless someone makes them behave that way. The following morning, investigators returned to the scene. The car hadn't been tampered with. No signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no blood, no dragged footprints. The ground told a calm story, too calm for what the timeline claimed had happened. Then came the first contradiction. A delivery driver, interviewed almost as an afterthought, mentioned seeing headlights near the access road after midnight. He wasn't sure of the time at first. He checked his route logs later that evening. 12:17 a.m. That was nearly 4 hours after the official timeline said the incident had already occurred. The statement was flagged but quietly set aside. One witness didn't dismantle a case. Not yet. By day 3, more cracks began to appear. A neighbor came forward, hesitant, uncertain, apologetic, and said they'd heard a car door slam close to 1 a.m. They hadn't reported it because they assumed it was nothing. In this town, people minded their business. That sound didn't belong in the timeline. Neither did the thermal data from a nearby traffic camera which showed heat movement along the access road well into the early hours of the morning. No clear images, just shapes, motion, presence. Something or someone had been there long after the story said it was over. The lead detective gathered the team in a small conference room late that night. They didn't argue yet, they didn't accuse, they just stared at the board. 2 timelines were forming, one neat, one messy. Only one could be true, and the messy one was starting to look more honest. That's when the question changed. Not what happened, but when did it really happen? Because if the timeline was wrong, then everything built on it was wrong too, and somewhere between 8:01 p.m. and dawn, the truth had been quietly rearranged. By the 4th day of the investigation, the timeline had stopped behaving like a sequence and started acting like a contradiction. The official version still claimed the incident ended shortly after 8 p.m. That was the narrative everyone outside the task force believed. It was clean, efficient, and emotionally manageable. Inside the investigation room, however, that version was quietly falling apart. The first problem was movement. Cell tower data didn't just show when the victim's phone stopped transmitting, it also showed where it had been trying to connect. At 8:01 p.m., the phone attempted a brief handshake with a tower it shouldn't have been anywhere near, one that served an area miles east of the gas station. The signal didn't complete, but it reached. That meant the phone, or at least its signal, had moved after the last confirmed sighting. No one had noticed it before because the data didn't fit the timeline, and data that doesn't fit often gets ignored. The second problem was temperature. Investigators revisited the car with forensic specialists, this time focusing not on damage, but on thermal patterns. Modern vehicles don't lie easily. The engine control module stores heat loss curves, silent witnesses to when a vehicle was last driven. According to those readings, the engine had cooled too slowly to have been parked at 8 p.m. The math didn't match. The car had been driven, or at least warm, well after midnight. That meant one of three things was true. 1, the timeline was wrong. 2, the vehicle had been moved. Or 3, someone wanted it to look like neither had happened. None of those possibilities were comforting. Then came the footage. A regional traffic camera had already been reviewed once and dismissed. No license plate, no clear faces, just a stretch of road and passing headlights. This time, a junior analyst watched it frame by frame. At 12:43 a.m., a vehicle slowed near the access road. At 12:45 a.m., its brake lights flared. At 12:46 a.m., the headlights cut. For nearly 3 minutes, nothing moved. Then, at 12:49 a.m., a second set of lights appeared, approaching from the opposite direction. 2 vehicles, 1 location, a time that wasn't supposed to exist. The room went quiet when the clip finished playing. No one spoke at first, because if this was connected, and it almost certainly was, then the incident hadn't been a single moment. It had been a sequence, a meeting, or worse, an exchange. The idea unsettled everyone. Cases that stretch over hours invite complexity. Complexity invites mistakes. Mistakes invite intent. That afternoon, detectives returned to interviews they thought were already complete. A gas station attendant was asked again about the victim's visit. This time, she hesitated. She remembered something she hadn't mentioned before. A second car. She hadn't thought it mattered. It hadn't been close enough to feel suspicious. Just a dark sedan idling at the edge of the lot. The driver never got out. She checked the time on the receipt log. 12:02 a.m. That was impossible, according to the official story, unless the official story had been wrong from the beginning. By evening, the board in the investigation room had been completely rewritten. The old timeline, the neat one, was erased. In its place was a jagged mess of timestamps, arrows, and question marks. Events overlapped. Hours doubled back on themselves. Gaps opened where answers should have been. One detective finally said what everyone else had been thinking. If we can't trust the time, we can't trust the motive. Because motives depend on pressure. Pressure depends on duration. And suddenly, this case wasn't about what happened. It was about how long someone had control. The lead investigator stood back and looked at the board. Somewhere between 8:01 p.m. and 1 a.m., the truth had been rearranged. Not erased, rearranged. And whoever had done it had assumed no one would ever question the clock. They were wrong. Because once time stops making sense, investigators stop asking polite questions. And the case enters a far more dangerous phase. The call came in just after sunrise. It wasn't dramatic, no panic in the voice, just hesitation, the kind that suggests someone has been awake all night arguing with their own memory. "I don't know if this matters," the caller said, "but I think I remembered something wrong." Those words are never harmless. The witness was a delivery driver who had passed through town the night everything supposedly ended at 8 p.m. He had already given a statement weeks earlier. According to that version, he'd driven straight through, no stops, no anomalies. But memory doesn't always surface on command. Sometimes it waits. When detectives sat across from him again, they noticed the change immediately. He wasn't trying to be helpful anymore. He was trying to be accurate. And that terrified him. He rubbed his hands together as he spoke. "I remembered the clock," he said. "That's what did it." He had stopped for fuel at a self-serve station just outside town. At the time, it felt routine, but later, while scrolling through his phone, he'd seen a photo he took that night, an accidental shot of the pump display. The timestamp read 12:17 a.m. That was when the unease started, because in his first statement, he'd said he was already 2 towns away by then. The photo changed everything. Investigators verified it, metadata intact, location confirmed. The driver hadn't been mistaken about being there, he'd been mistaken about when. And that meant something else happened during the missing hours. Then came the part he hadn't told anyone. While fueling, he noticed a couple standing near the edge of the lot. They weren't arguing, they weren't affectionate either. They stood too far apart for comfort, too close for coincidence. One of them kept checking the road, the other kept checking the time. At the moment, it felt like nothing. Now, it felt like a warning he'd ignored. "I didn't see faces clearly," he said, "but I remember how they stood, like they were waiting for something they didn't want to wait for." Investigators compared his description to other fragments: the dark sedan, the unexplained stop, the gap between midnight and dawn. It all started to align, not neatly, but convincingly. The timeline hadn't failed, it had been interrupted. Later that day, investigators re-interviewed another witness, someone they had almost dismissed entirely, a motel clerk. She had reported a late-night check-in that never made sense. The guest paid cash, refused housekeeping, and checked out before sunrise. At the time, there was no crime connected to the motel. Now there was. Her guest log showed a name that didn't match any ID, but the timestamp was clear: 1:03 a.m. That placed someone directly inside the missing window, someone who had wanted privacy, someone who had time. By evening, the case had shifted again. This wasn't about a single event that happened too fast to stop. It was about a series of choices made slowly enough to reconsider, and carried out anyway. That distinction matters, because impulsive acts create chaos, deliberate ones create cover stories, and cover stories need time. The lead investigator wrote a single sentence on the board: "The gap is where the truth lives." Everyone understood what that meant. The missing hours weren't empty, they were full of movement, decisions, and witnesses who hadn't known what they were seeing until it was already too late. As the team packed up for the night, one detective stayed behind, staring at the board. If people had crossed paths in those hours, if someone had waited, if someone had left, then the crime wasn't patternless. It just followed a pattern no one had been looking for, yet.
Alibis don't usually break all at once. They crack quietly, under repetition, under scrutiny, under the weight of new time. By the 4th week of re-interviews, detectives stopped asking what happened. They started asking when, and that changed everything. The first to feel it was a local contractor who had placed himself safely at home by 10 p.m. on the night in question. He'd said it casually, confidently, as if time were an afterthought. But confidence fades when clocks disagree. Phone records showed activity well past midnight. Not calls, not texts, but movement. His device pinged off a tower miles from his house at 12:41 a.m. When confronted, he didn't deny it. He hesitated. Then he adjusted. "Maybe I went for a drive," he said. "Couldn't sleep." That explanation might have worked if he hadn't said earlier that he'd taken sleeping medication that night. Details don't betray people. Patterns of convenience do. Next came the couple who claimed they'd been together all night. Investigators separated them this time. Same questions, same order, same pauses. Their stories matched until they didn't. She said they watched television until late. He said they fell asleep early. She remembered a knock at the door. He remembered silence. Neither was lying outright. They were misaligned, which is often worse. Because rehearsed lies sound smooth, real-time adjustments don't. By midweek, detectives had created a secondary board. Not suspects, not witnesses, time conflicts. Every pinned note represented someone who had drifted into the missing hours without realizing it, or worse, realizing it and hoping no one would notice. The most damaging crack came from a person investigators hadn't expected to revisit at all: a patrol officer. Off duty that night, out of uniform, initially cleared within minutes, but clearance depends on context, and context had changed. His statement placed him home by 11:30 p.m., but his vehicle appeared on traffic camera footage just after 1 a.m. heading toward the edge of town. When asked, he went quiet. Then he sighed. "I forgot," he said. That word hung in the room. Professionals don't forget time, they compress it. What followed wasn't accusation, it was silence, the kind that forces people to fill it with truth. "I didn't think it mattered," he finally said. "I didn't see anything." But investigators already knew that wasn't the point. Presence matters, even without action, especially without action. As more alibis fractured, a new realization emerged. No one had a complete night. Everyone had gaps, overlapping gaps, intersecting gaps. It wasn't chaos, it was choreography. That night, the lead investigator replayed footage again, frame by frame, not looking for faces, looking for timing. Cars passing each other, lights turning off, shadows shifting direction. And then it appeared, a moment where two vehicles slowed at the same intersection, both within the missing window, both previously cleared, both now questionable. The timeline didn't just bend there, it connected. By morning, the case file had doubled in size, not because of new evidence, but because of corrected memory. And corrected memory is dangerous, because once people realize time can implicate them, they stop volunteering it. The team knew what came next. They had enough fractures now to apply pressure, enough inconsistencies to stop asking politely, enough clarity to stop guessing. The investigation had crossed a line, from reconstruction to confrontation.
Every investigation has a moment investigators later refer to simply as the hour. Not the crime, not the arrest. The hour when the truth can no longer hide inside the margins of time. For this case, it began at 1:17 a.m. That timestamp surfaced quietly. No dramatic discovery, no confession, just a discrepancy buried inside a routine data poll, a security badge log from a municipal building near the courthouse. The building was supposed to be empty overnight, but one badge had been used, once, at 1:17 a.m. The badge belonged to someone already interviewed, someone already cleared, someone who had sworn they were nowhere near the area. Investigators didn't react immediately. They waited. They rebuilt the timeline around that single minute, and suddenly, everything aligned. Traffic camera footage showed a car slowing near the building at 1:14 a.m. Phone metadata placed a device nearby at 1:16. The badge swipe at 1:17. A vehicle leaving the area at 1:21. 4 minutes. That was all it took to collapse weeks of uncertainty. When detectives brought the individual back in, they didn't accuse. They didn't confront. They asked one question. "Walk us through 1 to 2 a.m. again." The room changed instantly. The answer came slower this time. Details blurred. Confidence vanished. And when the badge log was placed gently on the table, the silence lasted longer than any denial could have. "I didn't think anyone would look at that," the person finally said. That sentence ended the mystery of the timeline, because it confirmed something investigators had suspected all along. This wasn't a crime hidden by complexity, it was hidden by assumption. From there, everything accelerated. Re-interviews turned sharp, statements were reclassified. What had once been considered coincidence was now treated as coordination. The gaps weren't random anymore, they were shared. The most revealing moment didn't come from technology, it came from pressure. Faced with mounting contradictions, one witness asked a single question: "What happens if my time doesn't match theirs?" The investigator didn't answer immediately, then said, "Then the truth has finally somewhere to stand." By the end of the week, the timeline board was complete. Every movement accounted for, every absence explained. The case no longer asked what happened, it asked why it had taken so long to admit it. That night, as the team prepared the final brief, the lead investigator wrote one line at the top of the report: "Time didn't fail, people did." What came next would test the strength of everything they'd built, because now the investigation had a direction, and directions lead to doors. Some open willingly, others don't.
Silence is rarely accidental in an investigation. It's a decision. And once the timeline solidified, silence became the loudest sound in the room. The interviews changed tone. No more open-ended questions, no more narrative freedom. Every person was now asked the same thing, the same way. Where were you between 1 and 2 a.m.? Not around that time, not roughly, exact. Some answered quickly, too quickly. Others stalled, trying to reconstruct memories that no longer felt cooperative. But one individual said nothing at all. They stared at the table. 30 seconds passed, then a minute. The investigator didn't interrupt, because silence, when allowed to stretch, reveals more than words ever could. When the person finally spoke, it wasn't a denial, it was a deflection. You already know what you think happened. That sentence told investigators everything they needed to hear. Innocent people argue facts, guilty people argue inevitability. Behind the scenes, pressure was building. Phone records had been reanalyzed, location data refined. Messages once dismissed as irrelevant were now read in sequence, not for meaning, but for timing. And timing was unforgiving. One message stood out, sent at 12:58 a.m. 4 words, "Is it done yet?" No reply followed, but a second message appeared at 1:26 a.m. "It's over." No names, no context, just time. Investigators didn't need more, they needed confirmation. And confirmation came from an unexpected place, a peripheral witness who had never been considered central to the case, someone who thought they didn't matter, someone who had stayed quiet because no one had asked them the right question. This time they did, and the answer landed hard. "I saw them together," the witness said. Not arguing, not rushing, just waiting. Waiting for time to pass, waiting for alibis to age, waiting for assumptions to do the work. That statement shifted the case from uncertainty to intent. This wasn't chaos, it was coordination, and coordination requires trust, the kind that cracks when one person realizes they're carrying the risk alone. The first cooperation request went out that night. Not public, not dramatic, just a quiet offer. Tell us your version before someone else tells theirs. By morning, one person had accepted. The silence was broken. And once broken, it couldn't be repaired. Because stories don't fall apart all at once. They unravel, thread by thread. As investigators reviewed the new statement, the lead detective leaned back and said something no one forgot. From here on, every lie cost someone else more. The case was no longer stalled, it was moving. And movement changes everything.
Every investigation reaches a moment when facts stop being debated and start being traded. This was that moment. The first person to cooperate didn't arrive with confidence. They arrived with exhaustion. The kind that settles in after weeks of carrying a story that no longer fits the evidence or the conscience. They asked one question before sitting down. If I tell you everything, does it end? The investigator didn't promise relief. They promised accuracy, and that was enough. The statement began carefully. Dates, locations, safe details. But then came the hesitation, a pause that stretched long enough to signal something important was about to surface. They weren't supposed to be there, the witness said quietly. That wasn't part of the plan. That single sentence fractured the case wide open, because plans imply forethought, and forethought destroys the idea of coincidence. Investigators leaned in, not physically, but mentally. They didn't interrupt. They let the story breathe. And slowly, the version they'd been given for months began to collapse under its own weight. The timeline shifted again, but this time forward. The gap between 1:12 a.m. and 1:21 a.m. was no longer empty. It was occupied by movement, by decisions, by a meeting that was never supposed to be acknowledged,
The cooperating witness described it plainly. No drama, no embellishment. A quiet exchange, a brief disagreement. A choice made in real time, not panic, but calculation. And then the words investigators had been waiting for. Once it happened, everyone just assumed it would go away. That assumption had protected them until now. Cross-checking began immediately. Security footage timestamps aligned. Phone pings confirmed proximity. A vehicle once dismissed as irrelevant re-entered the frame. Not speeding, not fleeing, but leaving slowly. Slow departures suggest confidence. Confidence suggests expectation. The lead detective stepped out of the room and made 3 calls. Not to the press, not to supervisors, to prosecutors, because the case had crossed an invisible threshold. This was no longer about what might have happened. It was about what could now be proven. Inside the interview room, the cooperating witness said one final thing before asking for a break. "They think I broke first," they said, "but I wasn't the first." That changed everything. Because it meant someone else had already slipped. Someone whose story hadn't been tested yet. Someone who still believed silence was protection. By nightfall, investigators were preparing a second interview. This one wouldn't be gentle. This one would be precise. Because once one story breaks, the others don't hold. They compete. And truth wins by outlasting lies. The board in the briefing room was updated. Red lines replaced question marks. And beneath the timeline, someone wrote a single sentence. "They know we know." The case was no longer fragile. It was pressurized. And pressure changes behavior. Alibis don't fail all at once. They unravel slowly, thread by thread, until the person holding them realizes too late that they've been standing on loose fabric the entire time. The second interview began with confidence. Too much of it. The subject sat upright, hands folded, voice steady. They had told this story before, to friends, to coworkers, to themselves. Repetition had made it feel safe. "I already explained where I was," they said. "Nothing's changed." The investigator nodded. "That's true," they replied calmly, "but something else has." They didn't accuse, they clarified. They restated the alibi exactly as it had been given months earlier. Same words, same timing, same pauses. Then they slid a single document across the table. Not dramatic, not threatening, just factual. The document showed a location ping, not precise enough to accuse, but precise enough to contradict. The subject glanced down, then back up. That can't be right. The investigator didn't argue, they waited. Silence does more work than questions. In the quiet, the subject began explaining without being asked. Technical errors, phone glitches, bad data. Each explanation arrived faster than the last. Speed reveals fear. Then came the moment investigators had prepared for, a small adjustment. "You said you left at 12:58, the investigator said, casually checking notes. "But earlier you told another officer it was closer to 1:05. The subject froze. Not visibly, but internally. Because lies don't collapse when confronted with truth. They collapse when confronted with themselves. They corrected it quickly. Too quickly. "I mean, yeah, 1:05, that's what I meant." The investigator nodded again. "Okay, and that would put you where at 1:12? That was the trap. Not aggressive, not obvious, but unavoidable. The subject hesitated, and hesitation is measurable. Investigators had already mapped the answer. They knew where that timing placed the subject. They knew who else was there. They knew the alibi didn't just fail, it collided with another person's account. 2 stories couldn't be true at the same time, and neither person knew the other had already spoken. The subject leaned back, their confidence drained. "Why are we doing this?" they asked. The investigator answered honestly, "Because timelines don't lie. People do, sometimes without meaning to." That was when the investigator asked the question every investigator waits for. What if I got some details wrong? The room shifted, because wrong is a softer word for false. The investigator closed the folder. We'll write down what you say now, and it will be compared to what others have said. No threat, just inevitability. The subject exhaled, long, heavy, and then they said something they hadn't planned to say. I didn't think it would matter. That sentence changed the case again, because it wasn't denial, it was justification, and justification only comes after involvement. By the time the interview ended, the alibi no longer existed. It hadn't been disproven, it had been abandoned. Outside the room, investigators updated the board once more. Another line drawn, another window closed, and beneath the timeline, someone added, "No safe version left." The case was no longer about when events happened, it was about why they were hidden and who benefited most from the confusion. Every investigation reaches a moment when the truth stops hiding behind lies and starts hiding behind silence. By the time Chapter 9 began, investigators were no longer asking what happened. They were asking a harder question. Who knew and chose not to speak? Witness lists are deceptive. On paper, they look clean. Names, dates, statements. But in reality, witnesses are people, and people protect themselves first. The first name brought back wasn't a suspect. It was someone trusted, a neighbor, a colleague, someone who had said, "I didn't see anything unusual." At the time, the statement felt harmless. Now, it felt incomplete. Investigators replayed their original interview. Same calm tone, same steady eye contact. But something stood out, a pause that had been ignored months earlier. A pause before the word nothing. This time, the interview was different. No small talk, no easing in, just one opening sentence. "You were closer than anyone else that night." The witness swallowed. "I already told you what I know," they said. The investigator nodded. "Yes," they replied, "but not what you noticed." That distinction cracked the door. People remember more than they admit, especially when memory threatens comfort. The witness looked down. "I didn't think it mattered," they said quietly. The same words again. Investigators had heard that phrase before. It wasn't coincidence, it was culture. When pressed gently, never aggressively, details began to surface. A car that stayed longer than expected, a voice raised briefly then cut short, a light that went off, then on again. Nothing dramatic, everything important. "What made you decide not to mention this earlier?" the investigator asked. The witness hesitated, then answered honestly, "I didn't want to be involved." That answer landed harder than any lie, because it explained the case's long silence. Fear doesn't erase truth, it buries it. Another witness was brought in, then another. Each one had told themselves the same story. "Someone else will say it. It's probably nothing. I don't want trouble." But timelines don't tolerate avoidance. When investigators overlaid the new details, something terrifyingly clear emerged. Multiple people had seen fragments of the same moment, individually meaningless, together undeniable. The case board changed again, not with suspects, with connections, small arrows, shared time windows, overlapping vantage points. The truth hadn't been hidden by one person, it had been hidden by many, accidentally, quietly, collectively. One investigator stood back and said it out loud. This wasn't invisible. No one disagreed. The final interview of the day was the hardest. A witness who had been there the longest, who had known the most, who had said the least. "You understand why we're here," the investigator said. The witness nodded slowly. "I do now." "What stopped you before?" The witness exhaled. "Fear," they said, "of being wrong, of being blamed, of changing everything." The investigator paused. Everything was already changed. You just didn't know it yet. That night, investigators rewrote the case summary, not as a failure, but as a warning. Silence had been the final accomplice, and it had finally been confronted. With witnesses now speaking, the investigation gained something it had never had before: momentum. Because when people stop protecting themselves, they start protecting the truth.
Up until now, the case had been a collection of truths. Honest ones, partial ones, carefully delayed ones, but still fragmented. Chapter 10 is where fragmentation ends. Investigators didn't find the breakthrough in a dramatic raid or a surprise confession. They found it in paperwork. Old, ignored, filed under non-essential. It started with a timestamp, one that didn't belong. While reviewing witness statements side by side, an analyst noticed something subtle. 3 different people described the same moment, but each one placed it slightly differently in time, only minutes apart. But minutes matter. At first, it looked like human error, memory drift, stress, time distortion, until someone asked the question no one had asked before. What if the clock was wrong? They pulled records from everywhere: phone logs, security systems, vehicle data, municipal maintenance reports. One by one, the timelines were recalibrated. That's when the impossible became obvious. 2 events believed to be separate were actually the same event, viewed from different angles. The case had been split in 2 by assumption, and now it was being stitched back together by precision. Investigators rebuilt the night, minute by minute. Not what should have happened. What did? A delivery vehicle logged entry at 9:14 p.m. A witness remembered hearing a sound around 9. A security camera showed movement at 9:11, but the system was confirmed to be 3 minutes slow. That discrepancy had created a false gap. A gap where theories lived. A gap where doubt survived. Once corrected, the timeline collapsed inward. Everything aligned. The sound, the movement, the interruption, the disappearance. Not scattered. Sequential. One investigator leaned back and said quietly, "We've been chasing shadows." The room went silent. Not because they were unsure. Because they finally weren't. They placed a single marker on the board. A red line through every version of the story. Every witness now intersected at the same point. Same minute. Same location. Same action. The detail wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was mathematical. And that made it irrefutable. When suspects were re-evaluated under the corrected timeline, one name rose immediately. Not because of motive. Not because of history. But because only one person could physically be present at that exact time. Opportunity replaced speculation. Investigators didn't celebrate. They prepared. Because clarity brings responsibility. Before making any moves, they reran everything. Twice. Then again. The timeline held. Every time. "This is it," the lead investigator said. Not loudly. Not triumphantly. Just certain. The case that once refused to make sense now made too much sense to ignore. What followed would not be quiet. But for the first time, it would be clean. The moment the timeline collapsed into certainty, the room changed. No raised voices. No dramatic gestures. Just pens moving. A name was written on the board. Once. Then underlined. This wasn't a suspect in the traditional sense. No prior record. No public attention. No obvious motive. That's why they'd survived the investigation for so long. Under the old timeline, this person was adjacent to the case. Under the corrected one, they were central. Investigators rebuilt this individual's movements using the same discipline they used for the crime itself. No assumptions. No shortcuts. Only verified data. Cell tower pings placed them within range. Not proof, but proximity. A vehicle log placed their car passing a traffic sensor at 9:08 p.m. Earlier than expected. Important. A digital receipt showed a transaction at 9:03 p.m. 5 minutes closer than anyone realized. Each piece alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a corridor of presence. The lead investigator asked a simple question. If this person wasn't involved, why does everything point toward them when we remove the errors? No one answered. Because no one could. The team moved carefully. They didn't alert local authorities yet. They didn't request a warrant. They verified. Background checks revealed inconsistencies. Nothing criminal, but incomplete. Employment records didn't fully align with reported hours. A former supervisor remembered a late-night request for schedule flexibility. At the time, it seemed harmless. Now, it mattered. A colleague mentioned a sudden change in behavior after the incident. Quieter, more withdrawn. Again, not proof, but pattern. Investigators returned to witness statements. Not to challenge them, to re-listen. One witness had hesitated before answering a question. Another had corrected themselves mid-sentence. Not lies. Recollection under pressure. But once the name was known, those moments took on weight. Still, no accusations were made. Professional distance remained. Because this wasn't about blame. It was about truth surviving scrutiny. They ran the timeline again. This time with the name inserted. Everything held. The suspect had a window. A reason to be there. And now, a reason to stay silent. The lead investigator made the call. Prepare the interview. No cuffs. No press. No confrontation. Just questions. Because the strongest cases don't force answers. They invite them when there's nowhere left to hide. As the team prepared, one investigator paused at the board, looked at the timeline, and said, "Funny thing about time. It doesn't forget." Tomorrow, the case would speak. The interview room wasn't designed to intimidate. That was intentional. Neutral walls. Soft lighting. A table just wide enough to feel formal, not confrontational. When the subject entered, they didn't look nervous. They looked prepared. That concerned the investigators more than fear ever could. No one accused them of anything. Not yet. The lead investigator began with routine questions. Name. Employment history. General timeline of the day in question. The answers came smoothly, almost rehearsed. They matched the original version of events. The flawed timeline. The one everyone had believed for years. That was the first crack. The investigator didn't interrupt, didn't challenge, just nodded, and took notes. Then came the pause. A deliberate silence. The investigator leaned back and asked, "Can you walk us through that night again? But this time, start an hour earlier." The subject hesitated. Not long, just long enough. They adjusted the story. Subtle changes. A detail added. Another removed. Still calm. Still polite. But now, the words were drifting away from the data. The investigator slid a folder across the table. Not aggressively. Almost casually. Inside were timestamps. Cell records. Traffic sensor logs. Digital receipts. No commentary. Just facts. The subject glanced at the papers. Then back up. Still calm. But something had shifted. The investigator spoke softly. "These records place you closer to the location than you mentioned." The response was immediate. An explanation. Technical. Confident. Almost convincing. But then came the follow-up. "Help us understand why this receipt exists 5 minutes earlier than your account." Silence. Longer this time. The subject exhaled. Not dramatically, but deeply. "I might be misremembering," they said. That sentence changed everything. Because earlier, they had claimed certainty. Now, memory was suddenly unreliable. The investigator nodded. "That's understandable," they said. "Time can blur things." Then they leaned forward. "But it doesn't blur records." The room stayed quiet. No raised voices. No threats. The subject looked down. Hands folded. Then unfolded. "What are you saying?" they asked. The investigator answered carefully. "We're saying the timeline you believed protected you doesn't exist anymore." Another pause. The subject spoke again. This time, slower. "I didn't plan anything," they said. No one had used the word plan. That was the second crack. The investigator didn't react. Just noted it. They continued asking questions. Not about guilt. About sequence. "Where were you at 8:45? Why did you leave early? Who knew your schedule changed?" Each answer created friction. Not contradiction, compression. The subject's story was shrinking. Less room to maneuver. Eventually, the investigator closed the folder. Not with finality. With patience. "We're not here to rush this," they said. But the truth tends to surface when time stops being flexible. The subject looked up. Eyes tired now. Less controlled. "I need a break," they said. The interview paused. But the case didn't. Because what mattered most had already happened. Not a confession. Not yet. But something far more important. The timeline now belonged to the investigators. And once time stops working in your favor, it starts working against you. The break lasted 15 minutes. No longer. No shorter. Exactly enough time for patterns to settle. Inside the observation room, no one spoke. They watched. The subject sat alone now. No questions. No pressure. Just time. Time does strange things when there's nothing left to control. The investigators reviewed the interview. Not the answers. The pauses. The first long silence appeared right after the timeline shifted. The second after the receipt. The third after the word plan slipped out. None of it was dramatic. That was the point. The subject was brought back in. This time, the room felt smaller. Not physically. Psychologically. The investigator didn't sit immediately. They stood by the wall. Arms relaxed. Non-threatening. "No rush," they said. "We can take this slow." The subject nodded. Didn't speak. Silence stretched. 10 seconds. 20. 30. In that quiet, something changed. The subject began to fill the space. Not with facts. With assumptions. "You think I was there longer than I said?" they offered. The investigator didn't respond. Just waited. "So you think I lied?" Still nothing. Silence has weight. And when it's allowed to settle, people try to escape it. "I didn't lie," the subject said quickly. "I just left earlier than I remembered." The investigator finally spoke. "Earlier or later?" The correction landed softly. But it landed. The subject frowned. Eyes flicked down. Then back up. "I don't remember exactly," they said. Another shift. From certainty to uncertainty. The investigator nodded. "Let's talk about what you do remember." They didn't mention evidence. Didn't mention records. Just asked the subject to describe the moment they left. The subject spoke carefully. Describing doors. Lights. Sounds. But something was missing. A detail that appeared in every other witness account. The investigator noticed. "So you didn't hear the announcement?" The subject froze. Just for a beat. "What announcement?" they asked. The investigator glanced at the notes. There was a system alert. Audible. Hard to miss. The subject hesitated. Then said, "I must have been distracted." That explanation created a problem. Because the alert was time-stamped. The investigator leaned forward slightly. "If you didn't hear it, that suggests you left before it happened." Silence again. "Longer now." The subject swallowed. "No," they said quietly. "I was still there." Two statements. Only one could be true. The investigator didn't choose. They let the silence choose. Seconds passed. The subject's shoulders dropped. Just a little. "I didn't want to get involved," they said. That was new. "Involved in what?" the investigator asked. Another pause. Then, "In what happened after?" No one interrupted. The subject continued. "I didn't cause it. But I knew something was wrong." The room felt heavier now. The investigator spoke gently. "Knowing something is wrong, and leaving anyway, that matters." The subject nodded. Eyes on the table. Silence returned. But this time, it wasn't resistance. It was acceptance. The investigator closed their notebook. "We'll stop here for today." As the subject was escorted out, one thing was clear. They hadn't confessed. But they had placed themselves in the timeline. And once silence becomes evidence, it doesn't fade. It multiplies.
They didn't come forward. They didn't call. They didn't even think they mattered. Their names surfaced quietly, buried in a service log. Not a suspect, not a victim, just a line entry with a timestamp that didn't quite fit. The investigators circled it once, then twice. This person had been present on the edge of the event, close enough to see, far enough to forget. They lived nearby, worked nearby, passed through that place almost every day. Routine creates invisibility. When the investigators arrived, the door was already open. Not suspicious, just familiar. The witness looked confused when they explained why they were there. "I didn't see anything important," they said immediately. That sentence always mattered. The investigator smiled politely. "That's okay. We're not here about something dramatic." They sat at the small kitchen table. Sunlight came through the window. Normal life continued. "What do you remember about that evening?" the investigator asked. The witness shrugged. "Same as always." They described dinner, noise from outside, a brief interruption, then silence again. The investigator listened closely, not to the story, to the rhythm. "What time was that interruption?" they asked. The witness paused. "I don't know. Early." "Before or after dinner?" the investigator clarified. The witness frowned. "After," then stopped. "No, wait." That moment mattered. They leaned back, thinking harder than they had in years. "It was before," they said slowly. "I remember because I reheated the food after." The investigator didn't react, just nodded. That single correction shifted the timeline. "Did you notice anyone outside?" the investigator asked. "Not really," the witness said, then added, "Well, there was someone." The word "someone" opened the door. They described a figure, unremarkable, no clear face, but a detail stood out. "They were waiting," the witness said, "not walking, not passing through." Waiting implies intention. "Where were they standing?" the investigator asked. The witness pointed through the window. "Right there, near the side entrance." The investigator checked the map. That entrance wasn't visible from the main road. "Did you hear anything unusual?" they asked. The witness hesitated. "There was a sound, like metal." That sound hadn't appeared in any report. "Can you describe it?" they asked. "Not loud," the witness said. "Controlled, like someone trying not to be heard." The room felt different now. The witness felt it too. "I didn't think it mattered," they said quietly. "I thought it was nothing." The investigator met their eyes. Nothing only becomes something when enough people ignore it. They reviewed photos, not suspects, locations. The witness pointed again. "That's the spot." And there it was, a camera angle that had never been reviewed properly because no one thought anyone stood there. Until now. The investigator stood, thanked them, left without drama. But as they walked back to the car, they made a note. This witness didn't observe the crime. They observed the gap before it. And gaps are where truth hides.
For years, the case failed because it was never seen as one thing. It was treated as fragments. A sound here, a timestamp there, a witness who didn't know they were one. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just pieces that never touched. Until now. The investigators returned to the timeline one last time, not to add anything new, but to remove assumptions. They laid everything out across a long table. Photos, logs, statements, maps. Not in order of discovery, but in order of reality. That's when it appeared. Not a gap, a pattern hiding inside disorder. The sound of metal, the figure waiting, the camera angle ignored for years, the reheated dinner, the timestamp that never fit. They didn't contradict each other, they completed each other. The investigator marked a time window on the board, just 12 minutes. That window explained everything. Why no one saw the suspect arrive, why the victim's movement felt wrong, why the timeline never aligned.
The crime hadn't been rushed, it had been precise. A controlled entry, a short presence, a deliberate exit. Someone had known exactly when to act and exactly where not to be seen. The camera footage was reviewed again, not at normal speed, but frame by frame. And there it was, a reflection, barely visible, metal catching light for half a second. The room went quiet. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The suspect had been hiding in plain absence, never where people expected, always just outside attention. Records were pulled, employment histories, access permissions, movement logs. One name surfaced, then stopped, then surfaced again. Not random, not accidental. When the investigators confronted the suspect, there was no outburst, no denial, no performance, just silence. The kind that arrives when someone realizes the story is finally complete. The confession wasn't emotional, it was factual, clean, detailed. Because the truth no longer needed force, it had structure now. The case was closed quietly. No press spectacle, no dramatic headlines. But the town noticed. The weight lifted slowly. People slept easier without knowing why. Justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives accurately. The investigator returned the files to storage, labeled final. Before leaving, they paused, looked once more at the timeline. It made sense now, because it was never broken, only misunderstood.